It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales' face as she exited that private meeting sent everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Princess Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside those walls, where silence is not just tradition but strategy, a meeting had taken place that would quietly ripple through the very core of the monarchy. It was not scheduled. It was not announced. And yet, it brought together three figures whose presence alone signaled that something far more serious was unfolding beneath the surface. William, Prince of Wales, stood alongside Catherine, both summoned into a private consultation that, according to those familiar with palace routines, broke every norm of timing and protocol. This was not a ceremonial discussion or a routine briefing. It was urgent, contained, and deeply unsettling. Reports suggest that the conversation had been triggered by unexpected findings, details emerging not from crisis, but from something as routine as a scheduled evaluation. That alone made it more disturbing, because routine is where the palace finds comfort, where everything is predictable, controlled, and carefully managed. But this time, something had disrupted that rhythm. Something had forced the Queen's most trusted medical advisor to step forward, to request a direct and immediate audience. And in a system where access is everything, that request was granted without hesitation. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. Palace aides, usually composed and efficient, were seen moving with unusual urgency. Corridors were cleared. Conversations were cut short. Instructions were given in hushed tones, not written, not recorded, but understood. There was no official lockdown, yet the effect was the same. A silence fell, not the calm, controlled silence of royal protocol, but a tense, watchful quiet that suggested something was being contained before it could spread. And then came the moment that no one could ignore. Catherine emerging from that room, not with the calm composure that has defined her public image for years, but with something else, entirely. Those who saw her in that instant describe a change that was impossible to miss. Her expression, usually steady and measured, carried a weight that hadn't been there before. She avoided eye contact. She moved quickly. And for the first time in a long time, she looked shaken, not publicly, not dramatically, but enough for those trained to notice the smallest details to understand that something inside that room had altered everything. What followed only deepened the unease. Evening, away from the formal expectations of royal life, William was seen with Charlotte in a moment that insiders describe as unusually emotional. There was no audience. No cameras. Just a father holding his daughter a little closer than usual, a little longer than usual. And in a family where every gesture is measured, even that small deviation spoke volumes. It suggested not just concern, but a quiet attempt to protect, to reassure, to hold on to something that suddenly felt uncertain. Meanwhile, those who watched the monarchy closely, the correspondents, the insiders, the observers who read between every line began to connect dots that had been scattered over weeks, subtle changes, slight adjustments, moments that, on their own, meant nothing. But together, they formed a pattern that was becoming harder to dismiss. Some described it as a shift in tone. Others called it a growing tension. But all agreed on one thing. Something had been building long before this meeting, and now it had reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden. And perhaps most telling of all was the presence of medical figures within Kensington Palace that day. Not publicly acknowledged, not formally introduced, but noticed. Because in a system designed to minimize disruption, any deviation stands out. And this was no minor deviation. It was a signal. A quiet, unmistakable indication that whatever had been discussed behind those closed doors was serious enough to bypass routine, serious enough to demand immediate attention, and serious enough to leave even the most composed members of the royal family visibly affected. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's health, it was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried, until now. It wasn't just any physician, it was the Queen's most trusted medical confidant, a figure bound by decades of royal silence. So why did he say anything at all? Because in a system where discretion is not optional but absolute, For someone like that to step forward unprompted, direct, and urgent meant the situation had already crossed a line no one inside the palace could afford to ignore. This was not a doctor who dealt in speculation or alarm. His role had always been the opposite: to contain, to reassure, to quietly resolve. For decades, he had operated within a structure built on one unbreakable principle: nothing leaves the room. And yet, on this occasion, something did. Not publicly, not recklessly, but deliberately enough to reach Catherine, Princess of Wales, and through her, shift the balance of everything that followed. Those familiar with royal protocol understand how tightly controlled access truly is. Even senior figures must wait, must request, must justify. But reports suggest that this time, the usual sequence was quietly set aside. The request was not processed, it was answered. A direct audience. Immediate, no delays, no intermediaries. And that alone raised questions that no one dared ask out loud. Because if protocol had been bypassed, it wasn't convenience, it was necessity. The physician himself was no ordinary presence. His connection to the monarchy extended far beyond a single generation. He was part of a lineage of trust, a figure who had witnessed transitions, crises, and carefully managed truths that never reached the public domain. His role was not simply medical, it was historical. He carried knowledge that spanned decades, knowledge that had been preserved not through records, but through silence. And for someone like that to speak, even within the confines of a private meeting, suggested that what he carried into that room was heavier than anything the palace had faced in years. What remains most striking, however, is not just that he spoke, but how his words were received. Insiders described the moment as deeply irregular, not because of any visible reaction, but because of the shift in atmosphere that followed. Conversations reportedly slowed. Responses became measured, almost cautious. It was as if the room itself had recalibrated around what had just been said. And at the center of that shift was Catherine, absorbing information that was not only unexpected, but impossible to ignore. There are suggestions that the tone of the meeting changed instantly, that whatever began as a consultation quickly became something else entirely. Not a discussion, not even a decision, but a realization. The kind that doesn't arrive gradually, but all at once sharp, undeniable, and impossible to reverse. And in that moment, the roles within the room may have subtly shifted as well. Because this was no longer just about information being delivered. It was about responsibility being transferred. And that is where the tension deepens. Because if the physician had chosen to speak, it means he believed the information could no longer remain contained within the traditional boundaries of royal discretion. It means he understood that silence, in this case, might carry consequences far greater than disclosure. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it suggests that what he revealed was not entirely new but something that had been known, managed, and kept hidden until the present moment forced it back into the light. For Catherine, this wasn't just another private briefing. It was a turning point, the kind that separates before from after, uncertainty from awareness. And while the palace would continue to operate as it always had, calm, composed, controlled, those within its inner circle understood that something fundamental had shifted. Not publicly. Not yet, but internally, irreversibly. And what he revealed didn't just concern the present, it reached back into a history the monarchy had spent decades protecting. For years, the signs were there, subtle, scattered, easily dismissed. But now they were impossible to ignore. What once felt like isolated moments, small deviations in timing, tone, or presence had begun to align into something far more deliberate. Those who had spent years observing the monarchy, not just as spectators but as careful interpreters of its rhythms, started to revisit what they had previously overlooked. Because within an institution built on consistency, even the smallest inconsistency carries weight. And now, those inconsistencies were beginning to form a pattern that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. There were quiet references, never public, never confirmed, but always present beneath the surface, mentions of past royal medical concerns that had been managed with precision, contained with discipline, and ultimately sealed within the private archives of the institution. These were not stories meant for public consumption. They were part of an internal history, one that acknowledged vulnerability while presenting strength. And yet, as current concerns emerged, Those historical echoes began to feel less like distant memories and more like warnings that had gone unheeded. At the center of this growing realization was Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role had quietly evolved over recent months. What began as occasional involvement in private discussions had gradually deepened into something more consistent, more deliberate. Reports suggest she had been present at multiple consultations, not as an observer, but as someone being prepared, briefed, informed, and slowly brought into a reality that had been unfolding long before that now infamous meeting. And with each conversation, the pieces of a larger puzzle began to take shape. Behind closed doors, documents were reportedly revisited records that had remained untouched for years, perhaps even decades. Not because they were forgotten, but because they were deliberately left alone. Within those archives lay details that, when viewed individually, seemed manageable. But when placed side by side, they revealed something far more complex. A thread. A continuity. The suggestion of hereditary patterns that, while never publicly acknowledged, had quietly influenced decisions within the royal household for generations. And while these internal movements remained hidden, the outside world began to notice something else entirely. Subtle changes in Princess Charlotte's public appearances. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be definitively pointed to, but enough to spark quiet conversations among royal watchers. A slight shift in scheduling. A different tone in her interactions. Moments that felt just a fraction more controlled than before. On their own, they meant nothing. But within the context of everything else, they became impossible to ignore. The palace, as it always does, responded with consistency. Appearances continued. Engagements were fulfilled. Smiles were maintained. The outward image remained unchanged, projecting stability and calm. But behind that carefully constructed exterior, the tension was unmistakable. Not chaotic, not visible, but present. A quiet awareness shared among those closest to the situation that something significant was unfolding beneath the surface. And this is where the contrast becomes most striking. Because while the monarchy presented strength, continuity, and control, internally it was navigating uncertainty, confronting questions that had no easy answers. The success of maintaining that balance between what is shown and what is hidden had always defined the institution. But now, that balance was being tested in ways it hadn't been for years. For Catherine, the realization was no longer gradual. It was immediate. The scattered pieces had aligned. The pattern was clear. And with that clarity came something far heavier than concern. It brought understanding. The kind that changes how every past moment is viewed, how every future decision is made. Because recognizing a pattern is not just about seeing what has been, it's about anticipating what comes next. But recognizing a pattern is one thing, understanding its implications would shake Catherine to her core. Behind the composed smile and unwavering poise, something inside Catherine, Princess of Wales, had shifted, and those closest to her could feel it. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself, yet quietly alters everything. Those who had long understood Catherine's rhythm, her consistency, her calm, her almost instinctive ability to balance public expectation with private reality, began to notice a subtle but meaningful difference. Not in what she said, but in what she withheld. Not in what she showed, but in what she chose to keep guarded. And within an institution built on observation, that distinction mattered more than anything spoken aloud. Over the following weeks, there were quiet adjustments to her schedule. Engagements that would normally be routine were either shortened or, in some cases, stepped away from entirely. No explanation was offered, and none was expected. Because in royal life, absence is often managed as carefully as presence. But this felt different. Not strategic, not calculated, but necessary. As if something beyond duty had begun to take precedence. Something that demanded her attention in a way that public responsibilities simply could not compete with. Even when she did appear, there was a shift that could not be ignored. Not in her words, they remained steady, measured, exactly as expected, but in the moments between them, a pause that lingered just a fraction, longer, a gaze that seemed more distant than before, the kind of subtle emotional strain that only becomes visible when everything else is perfectly controlled. And for those paying close attention, it suggested not weakness, but weight. The kind of internal burden that cannot be easily set aside, no matter how practiced the composure. That weight became even more apparent in her private moments with Princess Charlotte. Insiders describe a change not in affection but in intention, a heightened awareness, a quiet protectiveness that felt deeper, more deliberate. Time spent together was no longer just routine, it carried a sense of purpose, as if each interaction mattered more than it once had. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. The kind that transforms ordinary moments into something far more significant, far more fragile. And standing alongside her more visibly than before was William, Prince of Wales. His presence, always steady, had taken on a new dimension, not just as a partner in duty, but as a source of support that extended beyond public expectation. He appeared more often, stepped in more readily, as if recognizing that the balance Catherine had always maintained was beginning to strain under pressure. Together, they moved with a quiet coordination that spoke not of crisis, but of adaptation, two figures adjusting to a reality that had shifted beneath them. Those within the inner circle have described Catherine during this time with a phrase that lingers, focused but deeply unsettled. It captures the contradiction at the heart of everything, because outwardly, nothing had broken. The structure remained intact, the role continued. But internally, something had changed in a way that could not be reversed. She was not reacting, she was processing. Absorbing information that reshaped how she saw not only the present, but everything that had led to it. And this is where the true tension lies. Because Catherine is not only a public figure, she is a mother. And the weight of those two roles, usually balanced with remarkable precision, had begun to collide. The expectations of the crown demand stability, continuity, strength. But the instincts of motherhood demand something else entirely: protection, presence, and an unwavering focus on what matters most. And when those two forces meet under the pressure of uncertainty, the result is not simple. It is complex, emotional, and deeply human. For Catherine, this was no longer about managing appearances or fulfilling expectations. It was about navigating a reality that required both strength and vulnerability, both duty and instinct. And as that reality settled in, it became clear that what she now carried was not just concern, not just awareness, but something far more profound. Because what Catherine now carried wasn't just concern, it was knowledge that could redefine everything. Buried beneath centuries of tradition lies a truth the monarchy has never publicly confronted: a legacy, written not in ceremony but in silence. Because behind the grandeur, behind the rituals that have defined the institution for generations, there exists another layer, one that is never spoken of, never acknowledged, yet quietly shapes decisions in ways the public will never fully understand. It is a history not recorded in official accounts, but carried forward through discretion, passed carefully from one generation to the next. And within that history are moments that were never meant to resurface, moments that were contained, managed, and ultimately sealed away in the name of preserving stability. There have long been whispers, never confirmed, never denied, about medical histories that extended beyond what was publicly known. Not crises, not scandals, but complexities. Situations that required intervention, not for immediate survival, but for long-term continuity. Reports suggest that in earlier decades, certain concerns were addressed quietly, handled with precision and confidentiality, ensuring that the public image of strength remained untouched. These were not decisions made lightly. They were calculated, deliberate, and rooted in a single priority: the preservation of the royal lineage at all costs. And that is where the weight of this legacy becomes impossible to ignore. Because the monarchy is not just a family, it is an institution built on continuity. Every generation is expected to carry forward not only the responsibilities of the crown, but expectations that come with it. And when those expectations are threatened, even in the smallest way, the response has historically been swift and contained. Not through public acknowledgement, but through private resolution. Through actions taken behind closed doors, guided by those entrusted with safeguarding the future of the institution. It is widely believed that those within the Queen's generation were aware of these complexities. Not in a speculative sense, but in a practical one. They understood the balance that had to be maintained, the decisions that had to be made, and the consequences of allowing certain truths to surface. Silence, in that context, was not avoidance, it was protection. A deliberate choice to ensure that the stability of the monarchy remained intact, even if it meant carrying knowledge that could never be shared. Now, That silence has begun to shift, not publicly, not yet, but internally something has changed. Because at the center of this inherited reality now stands Catherine, Princess of Wales, no longer just an observer of the institution, but an active participant in its most guarded truths. What was once distant history has become immediate responsibility. What was once managed by others has now been placed, quietly but unmistakably, within her understanding. And this is where the past and present begin to converge. Because as Catherine processes what she has been told, the question is no longer just about what has happened before, but whether those same patterns are emerging again. Whether the decisions once made in silence are now being considered once more. And if they are, what that means for the future, not just for the institution, but for those at the very heart of it. There is no clear answer. Only the growing realization that history, when left unspoken, has a way of returning. Not exactly as it was, but close enough to raise questions that cannot be ignored. And within those questions lies a tension that continues to build a quiet, persistent uncertainty about what comes next, and whether the monarchy is prepared to confront something it has spent generations carefully avoiding. And as that legacy resurfaced, one question loomed larger than all the rest: what happens next? Silence from the palace is never accidental, and this time it spoke louder than any official statement ever could. Because within the machinery of the monarchy, silence is not absence. It is intention. It is strategy. It is the deliberate choice to say nothing while controlling everything. And in moments of uncertainty, that silence becomes even more precise, even more calculated, shaping not just what is heard, but what is allowed to exist in the public conversation. This time, the shift was immediate. Access tightened. Movement slowed. Information, once flowing through carefully managed channels, was suddenly restricted in ways that even seasoned observers found difficult to ignore. Media access, always curated, became even more selective. Invitations were limited. Briefings shortened. Questions deflected with an ease that suggested preparation rather than reaction. Journalists who had long operated within the boundaries of royal reporting began to notice the difference, not in what they were told, but in what they were no longer being offered. It was not a blackout. It was something far more controlled, a narrowing of focus, a quiet redirection of attention away from anything that might invite deeper scrutiny. At the same time, appearances continued, but with a precision that felt almost rehearsed. Catherine, Princess of Wales, maintained her presence, composed and steady, fulfilling her role with the same outward consistency that had always defined her. Alongside her, William, Prince of Wales, appeared equally composed, reinforcing the image of stability that the palace depends on in moments like this. Together, they projected exactly what was expected: continuity, calm, control. But beneath that surface, the timing, the structure, the tone of each appearance suggested something more deliberate, a carefully constructed narrative designed to reassure without revealing. Behind the scenes, senior aides moved quickly. Messaging was coordinated, not just in what was said, but in what was avoided. Words were chosen with precision. Statements were crafted to acknowledge without confirming, to respond without answering. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant adjustment as speculation began to build beyond the palace walls. And at the center of that effort was a single objective: maintain stability, no matter the cost. What stood out most, however, was the absence of direct denial. There were no firm dismissals, no clear rebuttals to the growing questions. Instead, there were reassurances carefully worded, intentionally vague. Phrases designed to calm rather than clarify. And in the world of royal communication, that distinction is critical. Because when something is truly unfounded, it is often addressed directly. But when the response remains measured, controlled, and incomplete, it suggests that there is more beneath the surface than can be openly acknowledged. Royal rota journalists, those closest to the inner workings of the institution, began to hint at what they described as managed narratives. Not falsehoods, but carefully shaped perspectives, a way of guiding the story without fully revealing it. And as those hints began to circulate, the gap between what was known internally and what was presented publicly became increasingly apparent. It was not a breakdown of communication, it was a recalibration. And yet, for all its precision, the strategy carried a risk, because silence, while powerful, also invites interpretation. And in the absence of clear answers, speculation grows. Quietly at first, then more rapidly, as each unanswered question leads to another. The public, accustomed to the steady rhythm of royal life, began to sense that something was different, not through official statements, but through the spaces between them. That is the paradox the palace now faced. The more controlled the response, the more attention it drew. The more carefully the narrative was managed, the more people began to look beyond it. And as that attention intensified, it became clear that the situation had moved beyond internal management. What had begun as a contained concern was now edging towards something far more visible, far more difficult to contain. But even the most controlled response couldn't contain what was already beginning to surface. What began behind palace walls was no longer contained because the world had started asking questions the palace couldn't ignore. At first, it was subtle. A shift in timing here, an unexplained absence there. The kind of details that usually pass unnoticed in the steady rhythm of royal life. But this time, they didn't. Because when patterns begin to change, even slightly, those who follow the monarchy closely start to look deeper. Media outlets, always attuned to the smallest deviation, began quietly noting inconsistencies in schedules that no longer aligned as seamlessly as before. Engagements were adjusted. Appearances shortened. Timelines that once flowed with precision now carried gaps that felt deliberate. And in those gaps, questions began to form. Those questions didn't stay confined to traditional reporting for long. They moved outward into the fast-moving world of social media, where speculation doesn't wait for confirmation. It builds, it spreads. It connects fragments into narratives that feel real, even when they are incomplete. And at the center of that growing conversation was Princess Charlotte. Not because anything definitive had been revealed, but because the absence of clarity created space for interpretation. Every public appearance was analyzed, every gesture examined, not for what was obvious, but for what might be hidden beneath the surface. Royal experts, usually aligned in their measured approach, found themselves divided. Some urged restraint, emphasizing the importance of privacy, particularly where children are concerned. Others, however, began to voice a more cautious concern, pointing to the accumulation of subtle signals that, when viewed together, suggested something more significant was unfolding. It wasn't a consensus, but it was enough to keep the conversation alive, enough to prevent it from being quietly dismissed. As that conversation grew, so did the scrutiny. Public appearances, once accepted at face value, were now examined with a level of detail rarely seen before. Every moment, every interaction, every pause was observed, interpreted, and discussed. Not out of malice, but out of curiosity driven by uncertainty. Because when the narrative is incomplete, people instinctively try to complete it themselves. And the more the palace maintained its silence, the more space there was for those interpretations to expand. Pressure began to build, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. A quiet expectation that at some point, clarity would be offered. That the palace, known for its ability to manage even the most complex situations, would step forward and provide reassurance that went beyond carefully chosen words. But that moment didn't come. Instead, the silence continued. Controlled, intentional, unbroken. At the center of it all, Catherine, Princess of Wales, and William, Prince of Wales, remained exactly as they had been composed, measured, unwavering in their public roles. They did not respond to speculation. They did not engage with the growing noise. Their silence was not avoidance, it was discipline. A reflection of the system they operate within, where speaking too soon can carry consequences just as significant as saying nothing at all. And yet, that silence carried its own weight. Because the more they said nothing, the more the world leaned in, searching for meaning in every detail that could be seen. This is where the tension reaches a new level. Because what was once contained is now exposed not through revelation, but through attention. The spotlight, once focused on routine engagements and ceremonial duties, has shifted. It now lingers, probing, questioning, waiting. And with each passing moment, the distance between what is known internally and what is understood publicly continues to grow. The palace, for all its experience in managing perception, now faces a challenge that cannot be resolved through strategy alone. Because when curiosity turns into expectation and expectation into pressure, the dynamic changes. It is no longer just about maintaining control, it is about responding to a narrative that is no longer entirely within their hands. And as the spotlight intensified, the truth edged closer to a revelation no one was prepared for. If what Catherine, Princess of Wales, was told is true, then this isn't just a moment, it's a turning point. That could redefine the future of the monarchy itself. Because everything that has unfolded so far, the silence, the patterns, the controlled responses, has been building towards something far greater than immediate concern. It has been pointing toward consequence, not just for the present, but for what lies ahead. And at the center of that future stands Princess Charlotte, whose role within the monarchy has always been understood in a certain way: structured, anticipated, secure. But now, understanding feels less certain. Not erased, not replaced, but complicated by factors that were never meant to enter the public conversation. For Catherine, this realization carries a weight that goes beyond duty. Because she is no longer just navigating her position as the future queen, she is doing so as a mother first. And that shift changes everything. The decisions she faces are no longer confined to tradition or expectation. They are shaped by instinct, by protection, by the quiet but powerful need to safeguard her child in a system that has always demanded sacrifice in the name of continuity. And within that tension lies a question that has no simple answer. How do you honor the crown without compromising the people you love most? This is where the monarchy itself begins to feel the strain. Because for generations, it has operated within a framework built on discretion, on the careful management of information, on the belief that certain truths are better kept within the walls of the institution. But the world has changed. Expectations have shifted. Transparency, once considered a risk, is now often seen as a necessity. And that creates a conflict that cannot be easily resolved. Because to reveal too much is to disrupt tradition. But to reveal nothing is to invite doubt. There are growing indications that this moment may force a reevaluation of how such matters are handled moving forward. Not through dramatic declarations, but through gradual shifts in approach. A reconsideration of what can remain private and what may need to be acknowledged. Because the balance that once held firm is now being tested by a world that no longer accepts silence as easily as it once did. And within that shift lies the potential for something new, something that could redefine not just how the monarchy operates, but how it is understood. Yet beneath all of this, beneath the strategy, the expectation, the legacy, there is something far more human. The emotional cost. Quiet moments that never reach the public, where the weight of responsibility is felt most deeply. Where decisions are not abstract but personal. Where the strength required to maintain composure comes at a price that few will ever fully see. And it is within those moments that the true impact of everything that has unfolded becomes clear. Because this is not just about one family navigating uncertainty. It is about an institution confronting the limits of its own traditions. It is about a future that may no longer align perfectly with the past. And it is about individuals, bound by duty, finding themselves at the intersection of expectation and reality, where every choice carries consequences that extend far beyond themselves. What makes this moment so significant is not just what it reveals, but what it demands. Adaptation, reflection, change, not immediate, not obvious, but inevitable. Because once a truth reaches this point, once it moves from silence into awareness, it cannot simply be set aside. It must be acknowledged, understood, and ultimately integrated into whatever comes next. And so, what began as a quiet conversation has become something far more profound. A catalyst, a shift, a moment that may, in time, be recognized as the beginning of a new chapter, one where the monarchy is forced to reconcile its past with the realities of its future, and where those at its center must redefine what it truly means to serve both the crown and each other. Because in the end, this was never just about one conversation, it was about a truth that changes everything. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.